Coming up, the UN holds urgent meetings in Istanbul about the state of climate action, finance and more.
The next 2 years stand as one of the best chances we have as an international community to ensure warming stays below 1.5 degrees.
A no-holds-barred discussion about how heat affects global cities.
The cities are heating even more than the rest of the world because of the very high density.
And children across Eastern Europe and Central Asia.
You have a natural ability to sweat and to adjust, whereas younger children, especially infants, don't have those natural abilities.
Whether there is appetite to change the way we eat.
What is the UN's official stance on veganism?
We are not in the position to push anybody.
And the nationally determined contributions the world cannot stop global warming without.
NDCs are not being implemented, so how does the UN plan to address this?
We are committed to provide support to countries for their new NDC aligned with 1.5 degrees.
Just 2 degrees is on. Now,
how does the UN address this common theme of not keeping climate promises?
this is the Marriott Hotel in Istanbul, where several UN organizations spent 3 days discussing what's referred to as nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, more specifically the successes, goals and challenges countries have and face in our collective mission to stop global warming. These are issues everyone should care about, specifically how our climate has been changing. So let's begin with what NDCs are and why they matter. NDCs can be complicated. For a crash course, I sat down with Nuri Ozbagdatli, a climate change specialist for Europe and Central Asia at the UN Development Programme.
So a nation determines how it will contribute to global climate targets. Is it that simple?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds simple as it sounds, but no matter it is simple or hard, it is the only option, best shot we ever have as civilization. Because climate change is a systemic threat. It threats on our everything, on our lifestyle, on our economy, on our food, water. Because it will make a change that you cannot predict ever. And if we don't make our next NDC cycle, NDC 3.0, talking with the Sustainable Development Goals and with higher ambitions to mitigate the GHG greenhouse gases emissions and look for the adaptation part to make societies, nations can continue to live within the new climate scenarios, then we will lose most of the things where the vulnerable groups like youth, children, women, underrepresented groups will face most of the threats.
What are NDCs exactly and why do they matter?
So NDCs are national climate plans. So every nation will come with a plan to make a world is still below 1.5 degrees, which is the Paris Agreement set goal. And it means that whole economy and whole society should be in this plan at the national level. It means that all nations come together and agree and work together in a multilateral way for meeting the Paris Agreement. And it is a matter because if we do not have a more ambitious and more implementable NDC in an inclusive way, then we will hit the thresholds.
What is the significance of NDC 3.0 as it relates to the global stock take that was announced after COP28 in Dubai last year?
So this is the third cycle after the Paris Agreement ratified by countries, and in the third cycle, which countries submit their national action plans, NDCs, in 5-cycle period. And in Dubai, when we have the first global stock take, we saw that the world is not on track, and we need to make GHG reductions more and faster than we envisaged before. That's why for the NDC 3.0, we need to make sure that our plan as national level and global level can take us to 1.5 degrees.
Current NDCs reduce emissions by far too little, and we're not meeting the trajectory that the science tells us, which is 43% reduction by 2030 compared to 2019 levels, and a 60% reduction by 2035 compared to 2019 levels, and then reaching net zero, of course, by 2050. In addition to the emission gap, it also highlights the implementation gap. NDCs that are not implemented are just words on paper.
So how does the UN address this common theme of not keeping climate promises?
So this year, UN Secretary General called all UN systems come together and support countries, work countries together. And this system is requested by UNDP Climate Promise. UNDP Climate Promise has been working with the countries since 2019 and already supported 85% of all developing countries. And what we saw with the Climate Promise support and collaboration with the countries, that more than 90% of the NDCs are better in mitigation, and more than 90% of the NDCs are aligned with adaptation, with their national adaptation plans. At that point, we are committed at UN-wide to provide support to countries for their new NDC aligned with 1.5 degrees. And implementation is critical here. What Climate Promise says, there are two gaps. The first gap is the bridge between NDCs and Sustainable Development Goals. And the second gap is about the ambitious targets and on-the-ground action for implementation. And implementation means finance. Implementation means capacities and technologies.
Finance underpins everything. As we said in the global stocktake, finance is a critical enabler of climate action. But it's the growing gap between the needs of developing countries and what is available.
What is the status of finance? How much money is required? How much money do we have at this point in time?
If you are lack of finance, and that finance that is not really related directly with the climate action, then you increase your trouble. And especially the developing countries, vulnerable countries, small island countries, these developed countries, which are more under threat compared to other countries, are really lacking of direct support, lacking of support. And here, we really push for multilateralism, that everyone, all countries, come together and discuss this, because every second counts, and we need to make this under the multilateralism, under the Paris Agreement.
We agree that we need to get working on NDCs, given the deadline, that many countries will need support to develop the NDCs and to implement them, and that we need to work this year across multiple fora, including through the MDBs, to unlock substantially more climate finance. But we don't agree with what the letter calls the, quote, reframing of ambition. It defines a, quote, high ambition NDC for developed countries as one that includes finance for developing countries. We find this not only inconsistent with the Paris Agreement and extremely controversial negotiations that took place in 2015, but highly prejudicial to the negotiations that are ongoing this year on the new quantified goal. So we do think the approach needs to be substantially reworked before being pursued.
For example, G20, they are responsible for 80% of whole GHG emissions. It is just the 20 countries. And when we see that the bottlenecks with the implementation has lots of reasons. Sometimes it's mainly on political commitments. Sometimes it's about trade. It's about finance. But then we see that geopolitics and the climate crisis that increasing the threats to countries are making climate action harder.
It will come as no surprise to you that the NDCs that are most important are those NDCs that come from the 20 biggest economies, the 20 highest emitters, because they will be able to shift 80% of emissions around the world. So yes, those are the ones that we will be focusing more on. And not only because they have the capacity to shift more, but also because they have the means to do it.
So, you know, the COP29 is the finance COP. Everyone is highlighting this because there is this new collective quantified goal. I mean, even the name is hard, right? NCQG, but it is to identify what is the gap and what is the way of funding the real needs on climate action, how the donors or providing funders and how the receivers will communicate this and governance this. So these are the discussions going on, and in COP29 we expect there will be a better process, a clear definition and everything.
Many African countries are mired in debt and struggling to invest in sustainable development.
We need $5 trillion annually for global ecological transition, with over $2 trillion of that specifically for developing countries.
Many have no access to effective debt relief, enjoy scarce resources, and clearly insufficient concessional funding to respond to the basic needs of their population and protect them from the ravages of a climate crisis they did nothing to create.
How we can make developing countries and least developed countries be more capable and you know, they can access to the real finance. So these are all the discussions we have been taking years and years under the UNFCCC negotiation process. And this year we expect in COP29 there will be some decisions that is highlighting the way through to COP30. And it is very important to highlight COP30 here because it will be the NDC COP. And we expect that in COP30 all the NDCs is aligned with 1.5.
Failure to meet the goal will lead to loss of homes and habitats. It would be a devastating and existential threat to many, especially the least developed countries and small island developing states. It means that people would be left behind. We all have a moral duty to avoid this outcome. Our previous promises now need to be delivered, not reinterpreted, fulfilled, not renegotiated. Everyone has a duty to make sure their action match their words.
We are talking about a transition. We are talking about the transition of an economy from fossil fuel dependency to renewables or more better fuels. The critical part here, if we make this transition, yes, it should be fast, but it should be also just.
It's clear there is a lot to be done, but failing to stick to our NDCs has severe consequences. The agriculture industry, for one, has been hit hard in parts of Africa and South America, and that has ripple effects even here in Eurasia. Evetta Zenina is an officer at the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization and the right person to talk to about what global food systems lack and need.
So according to the UN, food systems are under duress, although depending on where you live, how much money you make, it might be hard to decipher that. So what exactly is the state of agriculture at this time?
I would not tell that they're bad, they're challenging for sure. And the agri-food system, they have the different linkage between climate change and this complexity of being agri-food systems, because they obviously have the impact on greenhouse gas emissions, and this can be methane from livestock management or nitrous dioxide from fertilizers management. And if you manage them sustainably, obviously you can decrease the greenhouse gas emissions.
So what we eat matters. Some scientists suggest that switching to veganism or vegetarianism might help. What is the UN's official stance on veganism as a means of reducing global emissions?
So we don't have a particular state, because obviously we are not in the position to push anybody, but we do assess the different dietary patterns, yeah, because for example, if we go for, if we talk about some parts of the world that are meat-based dietary, of course the carbon footprint from this dietary is very huge. but it's also interlinked with the culture. That is why, for example, for Central Asia, where nomads are used to have these goats and sheep, it's very difficult to come and say, I'm sorry, but you need to be more sustainable because it's cultural. But the fact is that humanity needs to be more sustainable, especially for our region like Turkey, Central Asia. It's very important to be resilient because these countries depend on agriculture. Like it has like the second source, let's say, in GDP, and of course people are dependent and they're very, very vulnerable because the climate change impact is also worse in this region, like the quantity of droughts, the lack of the water resources. Initially, it's already deteriorating by climate change.
What do resilient food systems look like?
Resilience is close to efficiency. So you decrease your vulnerability on dependence on only one, for example, source of income. So instead of having only goats, you also grow some tomatoes. And then if you have some drought and your tomatoes die, then you have like as a plan B, your income from the goats. So there is always diversification as a part of the solution for enhancing your resilience. And of course, water-saving technologies, or depending on the area where you are and what, let's say, environmental degradation you have of your natural resources, you can combine, because already we have the knowledge. We can also use the traditional knowledge that farmers have, or we can come to the new equipment and innovation that nowadays we can offer to the farmers.
Too often, children and young people in general fall through the cracks during policy decisions. That's why we approached Maria Ozbeck from UNICEF. She knows how children's vulnerabilities and needs fit into this issue.
Maria, you tweeted that, quote, heat affects children differently from adults. Elaborate on that.
Well, children are not small adults. Children have a different physiology. They're smaller. And this is why climate change is having a different impact on children in comparison with adults. So in terms of heat waves, we know that children, and in particular younger children, infants, are particularly vulnerable. So based on a newly released report by UNICEF focusing on heat waves, we note that 1 in 4 young children are particularly vulnerable to heat stress. And this is double the global average. When it comes to air pollution, we know that children under 1 are much more vulnerable, and mortality linked to air pollution for children under 1 represent 85% of deaths in children attributed to air pollution in Europe and Central Asia.
So what do child-sensitive NDCs look like?
By having distinct solutions targeting children and targeting young children is specifically important. So one example in terms of the heat wave. So if you're exposed to a heat wave and heat stress, you have a natural ability to sweat and to adjust. Whereas younger children, especially infants, don't have those natural abilities as developed. So we need to have evidence and data in all NDCs, in all climate change policies and action plans, etc., that really shows how climate change is having an impact, and disaggregated for different types of children, for younger children and for older children, is of importance to make sure that we have adequate solutions. So evidence and data is one part of child-sensitive NDCs, referencing children, not just talking about youth and youth engagement, but referencing children in NDCs is also one of the factors. And for UNICEF, we note that globally, in terms of climate finance, only 2.4% of climate finance is targeting the key social services that children rely on. And for an NDC to be child and youth sensitive, we are asked for more focus on health, education, and social protection. We do acknowledge great progress in Europe and Central Asia. In comparison with the first submission of the NDC, many more NDCs are now acknowledging the disproportionate impact, but we do ask governments to clearly define the solutions for education, health, and social protection to be fully child and youth sensitive.
Jakarta, Lagos, Houston, Venice, a few cities that could be swallowed up by the sea at the turn of the century. But rising waters aren't the only threat. Gulnara Raul is with the UNDP's Cities Unit.
I think it's interesting we're having this conversation here with Istanbul in the background, a bustling metropolitan, but one that deals with heat stress like many other big cities across the world. Is heat the biggest challenge that cities face?
The science shows that the whole planet is heating, and cities are heating even more than the rest of the world because of the very high density, high level of economic activities. So, multiplied with, overall increase of the temperature across the world because of the climate change, and the urban heat islands. Yes, this is one of the major issues, but of course this is not kind of a single issue.
We have doubled the sea level rise during the past 20 years. We used to have 2.3 millimeters per year sea level rise 20 years ago, and recently we have seen 4.6 millimeters per year increases. And that increase is very much coming from the melting of major glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica.
And with irreversible melting underway, scientists currently expect an unavoidable rise of at least 1 to 2 meters. Obviously, this means less land, cities, homes, businesses. What does this all mean practically for people?
Well, it will require a lot of adaptation measures. I think at one hand, we need to mitigate these impacts, like building dams, moving the cities. There is lots of migration of the population from the coastal areas to other areas to address this issue. If we speak about the coastal areas, which means that if we had a building on the floor number 0, we need to start from floor number 1, right? If we speak about the extreme heat, we need to plant more trees, do more ecosystem restoration to create more shade. So there's multiple activities need to be done.
So what exactly is a circular city and how could that help?
Circular city is really important instrument to address climate change, especially at the city level. So of course you need to use less materials and resources across the whole value chain. Like if we take a building, starting from the planning of the building, operation, and to demolition. So we need to build less and we need to refurbish less. But to refurbish, it's very expensive. So we need to think about the financial instruments We need to speak about how the local authority, national authority, the banks are working together in order to work on the refurbishment of the buildings.
We are trying to create a very interesting look at how people deal with these things.
Yeah.
We're not trying to force feed climate change down people's throat.
Yeah.
We kind of believe in a more subtle approach for people to see what's happening.
Yeah.
You decide how you want to continue with your life, whether you want to do something to reduce emissions or continue contributing to what's happening.
Yeah.
So that's our approach to the program.
Yeah.
People generally don't like, creatures.
Because I guess the people who watch it don't even know what a national determined contribution is.
Electricity was not.
Mitigation measures, but also adaptation measures, because you can speak about it.
Good questions.